Okay, so welcome to another Sydney Lectures. And today we have our guest, Damion Waymer, who's going to be doing a quick intro of himself and then getting started for us. So I'll let him go ahead and do his own intro, tell you about who he is in case you don't know. You should know, but if you don't, he's going to let you know. And we'll get started today.
Good day, everyone. Thank you, Michael, for this opportunity to talk about memory and public relations. My name is Damion Waymer. I am a senior associate dean at the College of Communication and Information Sciences at the University of Alabama. I am a public relations researcher, primarily in the areas of power and diversity and race and identity, but also public relations education. I publish a lot of work on looking at pipeline issues and diversity issues in the classroom, in the pedagogy, and the practice. Yeah, and that's enough. I mean, let's get into it. But again, I'm grateful for the opportunity, and glad for this eclectic mix of students and mentors and colleagues. But let's set the stage with memory. So Michael, when extended the invitation, said, okay, hey, well, give some articles that might set the stage, for the conversation, and also sort of facilitate this as if it's a doctoral seminar. So I built in some sort of questions in here, so that we can start to wrestle with some of these ideas. But I want to start off with sort of a broad conceptualization of memory, right? So memory is a construct that's studied in multiple disciplines, mostly in sort of the neuroscience and psychology, because memory is defined as the faculty of the mind, right? And most of it is the faculty of the mind and information processing, right? So if we're thinking of, we also study memory in like information sciences and technology sciences. So you think about memory on a computer, you think about data retrieval, data storage, data archiving, right? I mean, so memory, if you're looking at a container metaphor, right? Like memory is the box in which holds information for encoding and decoding, retrieving at the appropriate time, right? And so when we look at that, either from a computer technological standpoint or from a neuroscience standpoint, looking at the mind, you're thinking about how memory fails, how to enhance memory. What is the short-term, long-term memory, right? And so if we're looking at memory and how it is predominantly studied, how is it relevant to public relations? And so part of this is just setting the stage for the conversation, and probing, it based on that definition, how is memory relevant to public relations? And I'll pause for a second because I want to spin that on the head and ask one, two, how would you define memory? And based on your definition of memory, how would you apply it in the study and conceptualization of public relations?
Okay, so just for this, if you want to just unmute yourself and go ahead and jump in, I assume that's what Damien's looking for. And then if you want to raise your hand, it looks like Mitchell's got his hand up here, so we'll let him start us off.
I suppose from a PR point of view, we want to tell stories that resonates with people's long-term memory, their cultural memory, otherwise we're not going to build a connection.
Beautiful, Mitchell. Any others?
I thought it was interesting this morning. My wife mentioned what she had seen and heard on television about one of the women whose husband was dangerously ill, and she put him in a life jacket, et cetera, to save him in case he started floating or needed to float. And she was out with a bunch of people doing plant things, and one of the women said, "Where did you hear that?" "I didn't hear that." So in the United States, our memory depends upon whether we watch Fox or MSNBC or CNN or PBS or something else. Otherwise, we have no memory, just what we watched on television.
Bob?
And then Carl.
Carl, yeah.
Well, I was going to be a little bit flippant. I'd never studied memory much while I was writing things, but in recent years, I've come to understand that memory is what young people have more of than they need and don't appreciate it.
Oh, definitely, right? I mean, so you have this neuroscientific view of memory. You have this technological container information science prevailing view of memory, you know, but in the social sciences and humanities, we've stretched the concept. We've stretched the construct, I say, to make it more inclusive. You know, so for example, in rhetoric, memory is the fourth canon of rhetoric, and it is closely tied to speaker credibility, right? So, you know, so think of it in terms of debate, right? So a good command of memory allows a rhetor on the spot to improvise key points, to respond to questions, and to refute opposing arguments, right? So memory could be used strategically in the art of persuasion, right? You know, so that's a theme that's going to carry us later. You know, memory can be used strategically in the art of persuasion, whether it's closely linked to credibility. I think another goal.
I'm not sure if you.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dean. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm intrigued by, and of course, this guy is thinking here. I'm intrigued by what Mitchell talked about with the cultural memory. And I'm wondering if that's has a former operational definition or constitutive definition, because I always tell my students they need to understand the world latitudinally, this breath, but they don't understand anything unless they understand it longitudinally. In this historical and its depth, but the idea of cultural memory, is that just a term you've come up with? I think I've heard that before, but I'm just kind of curious. I don't want to deviate from the presentation here, but I'm kind of intrigued by it. Like I say, the idea of cultural memory and its importance in public relations and in community building, et cetera, et cetera. Anyhow, maybe I am misappropriating time here or taking this.
Not at all, Dean, because that's literally where I was going next, right? I mean, so it's the perfect segue, because again, the humanities and social scientific approaches to memory clearly have the connection to what you see as the prevailing body of research in public relations. So first we talked about that rhetorical aspect of memory, and then it's that collective memory, that cultural collective memory. And so one of the pieces that I sent to the to Michael really drew on like the sociological thought, the Durkheimian, right? You know, so the Durkheimian approach to memory. And so and I just have, you know, it was on page 1461 for those who had it, but I just wanted to share a little bit of this because these two, the rhetorical and this collective memory, truly set the stage for how public relations studies memory. So Schuyler's in that tradition views collective memory as central to the production and reproduction of society. In the Durkheimian tradition, we focus on collective events, rituals, and ceremonies that play an important role in maintaining social solidarity. Collective memory with this tradition is defined as recollections of a shared past, which are passed on through ongoing processes of commemoration, officially sanctioned rituals, which remember a group through recalling upon a common heritage. And then they summarize a couple points, but the main one here is that the collective consciousness is paramount to society because it produces the society, it holds society together, and without that collective conscious, society cannot survive. So individuals produce collective consciousness through their interactions. The collective memory, right? And let me see, it was, and I think that gets at, I think it was Mitchell. It gets at what Mitchell was asking, right? You know, or saying that, hey, memory in public relations really is tied to the stories, and the stories have to have some sort of ability to resonate, right? In order to be effective or persuasive. I take it a step further by saying, again, going back to that rhetorical tradition, yes, but how you influence memory is strategic. And memory plays, practitioners and organizations use memory strategically to advance either self-centered or organizational aims. So if memory can be thought of as a way, you know, to strategically carry out this sort of art of persuasion, based on this broader conceptualization, what sort of studies, you know, doesn't matter who answers this, what sort of studies, I know one of the students said, hey, I do crisis and image repair, right? What sort of studies could you imagine doing or conceptualizing or theorizing to advance public relations knowledge based on this broader conceptualization of memory, either collective memory or the rhetorical canon of memory?
Well, actually, I think that earlier I was going to mention also we've got this idea of organizational or institutional memory. And I think that ties in with the idea of storytelling that Mitchell mentioned. And I think that would also be, that could be something you might look at, would be those organizational stories and how they resonate. You know, Shima might want to add to this because she's using symbolic convergence theory in her dissertation, but I think that could be a way to get at that also.
Any others?
I thought it was interesting as I listened to the press conferences today, how they were repeating a response narrative. What you should do over and over and over and over again. They did it yesterday, but today they were really pushing it because now people had a much better idea of what their immediate danger was rather than forecast danger. And I think that we miss a big opportunity if we don't see the narrative capabilities or failures of crisis, pre-crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis.
Shima?
Whenever we want to frame our messages in any context, in the activism context or in a corporate context, message framing means, like, if we want to make our messages persuasive, we need to tap into the shared meaning, to the collective conscious.
I think you froze. Consciousness.
Framing, which is like,
Okay, Shima, I'm not sure if you can hear us, but you're hanging and you're frozen there. Okay, I'll assume she'll log back in. Other people with their hands up, we can come back. Dean, you got your hand up there?
Yeah. Well, hopefully she can connect. It just occurs to me, and things that Bob has said over the years, and I won't reiterate or repeat them now, but got me thinking about, you know, just the tradition of indigenous peoples' oral history, you know, pre-literate oral history, and how stories not only recorded a history, perhaps imperfectly at times or with some embellishment at times, but also created this group solidarity, Durkheimian, if you will, solidarity. And I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but I'm just kind of intrigued. I haven't really thought about this in these terms here, but you know, again, the idea of community in that sense and the solidarity of people. So I'm not sure I got a point here. I'm just, I guess I'm trying to work this in my own mind here, and I find it quite intriguing.
you could create typologies, right? So you could map the cultural myths and the storytelling arcs. And, you know, in Australia, everyone loves a story of the underdog who struggles against adversity to succeed, you know, and corporations or organizations of all sorts can position themselves within those stories to, I guess, engender brand loyalty or people to, you know, be motivated by the cause. So you could develop, messaging typologies, I guess, or storytelling typologies.
I think it's also interesting the role of engagement in surfacing collective memory and its role, the role of practitioners as facilitators of bringing together and identifying, bringing together cultural memory and figuring out ways that we can honour it in our work. And I think that's a really important role of engagement practitioners within public relations.
Definitely. So what I did was with the articles that I selected for this week, for me, memories is more. Yes. What I did was I selected 5 articles that I thought sort of mapped how I view memory in public relations. I know everyone hasn't read their articles, but I'll at least give you name and title and sort of where I think these 5 areas, at least in how I've advanced my research in this area, how I look at and view memory. And then I'd like to spend, I guess, and we can talk about each one of those, whichever one you're interested in. And then the 6th one is where I'm currently trying to take memory in public relations. So no one read the 6th because the 6th is not published, or hopefully yet, right? But it is but it's out there under review. So let's see what happens with it. So speaking of crisis, right? The first, another step. Could you say that? Could you share that, Luke, before I transition on this point? I just read the first part of it, and I'm looking on my phone, so it's small. Would you share what you just put in the text?
Oh, sure. This was just another definition coming out of the IPR Bridge conference this summer. It's just a slightly different way than I'd thought of it before. We had these folks who were, supposedly some of the top measurement and evaluation people with major agencies. And a lot of what they were talking about was essentially just measuring memories, more so than I'd heard it explained in that way before. Very literal message recall work, which again, didn't strike me as necessarily the most advanced way that they could do that, but it's one of the ways that top folks in that universe are positioning their work and the valued organizations.
Thanks, Luke. So first theme 1 of memory, I think, is etching memory and using memory strategically as renewal discourse. So the etching of memory. And so I think one of the first or earlier studies in that particular vein in PR was written by Sherry Vail, Timothy Selnow, and Megan Heald. And it was published in 2011 in the 2011 in the Journal of Applied Communication Research. And it was Memorializing Crisis, the Oklahoma City National Memorial as Renewal Discourse, right? So in this case, right, you have a tragic event, a bombing, an act of terrorism, right? And so the city created a monument, right? And so we have public relations scholars who talk about statuary, monuments, art as text, but as public relations tools, right? Art could be a public relations tool. And so in this particular case, they created this memorial in response to the crisis, the terrorism attack, but it also is a post-crisis means of renewal discourse, bringing healing and some sort of peace and resolve to a community that was plagued by tragedy, right? But it is the etching of memory. So So you have that sort of theme that I think, and you saw a lot of crisis work from a rhetorical lens or interpretive lens, looking at renewal discourse and the etching of memory. I think phase two was, and Michael mentioned it, talk about the institutional or that organizational memory. It was a piece that Nika Logan and I did on, find the first page of that through my notes here. Yeah, so it was extending organizational memory and corporate communications research via autoethnography. And it was published in 2016 in the qualitative report. And in this piece, we're looking at practitioners' role in the construction of organizational memory and sharing that memory through artifacts, right? So website, press release, news, so you're archiving the organizational history through your various strategic communication tools, and also going to, I can't remember who shared that comment about the engagement and looking at the engagement of the practitioner and the role they're playing within that organization in shaping memory, creating memory, but also how memory influences organizational practices, organizational behaviors, and the public relations role in terms of the internal employee engagement or the internal organizational communication. So then I think stage three was looking at the opposite end of, I guess, the spectrum of erasure of memory, right? Or the attempt to erase memory. And so that was a piece written by Bob Heath and me in Public Relations Review in 2019. And it was the Public Relations Paradox of Erasure, Damnatio Memoriae as Public Relations Strategy and Tactic. And it really was a study, of me spending a lot of time in Rome looking at the Catholic Church's strategic attempt over the years to try to erase significant Roman artifacts, right? And I drew from, again, because most of the literature on memory comes from sort of neuroscience, psychology, I drew from the work of Freud, Sigmund Freud, and his work on memory. And Freud said memory is like the etch-a-sketch, right? And Freud talked about how no matter how you try to shake and clear that classic toy of the etch-a-sketch, there are always remnants of the original drawing left on that etch-a-sketch pad. So it can't be completely erased, right? But it provides that background for future work, activism, whatever it might be. And so in the US, so based on that work, we started to posit like, well, why do practitioners de facto sort of strategy is if something offends to try to remove it quickly. So I thought about, the famed star Bill Cosby, and immediately they removed his bust. They removed his star from the Hollywood Walk of Fame, right? They pulled all episodes of the Cosby Show, right? Because it's like, look, we have to try to separate ourselves from the offending action, right? You think about it in the sports context in the US or even the Olympics, international sports, so someone runs a 100-meter race, they win. Lance Armstrong cycles, he wins, right? And he's caught for doping, and then you strip the record, like you remove the medals and you strip the record. But it doesn't matter if you take the record. So many of us remember watching, in the US, like, man, what Lance is doing is phenomenal. How's this guy who just overcame prostate cancer riding a bike and winning? So we remember it, even if you take the record, right? And so that is that paradox of erasure, right? Like you can try to erase the memory, but remnants always are there, latent, like issues management, right? Like the stages of issues, like they might be dormant, but they can always reemerge in that issue cycle. Memories can be pulled upon and drawn upon for later in that vein. Stage 4 of this really is especially collective memory, is memory as hegemonic, right? And how organizations or actors strategically can etch memories to their advantage. And so this piece was one that is in press. It hasn't gotten an issue yet, but it is on public relations review as well. And this is also Bob Heath and me with Standing Their Ground, Southern White Hegemonic Defense of Place through Camouflage Narrative Continuity. In this piece, we're looking at Confederate statues again, right? But we're looking at Confederate statues. We're looking at Confederate statues, Confederate memorabilia, looking at West Point Academy. We're setting the context of place, right? But it's broader than place, right? If we're talking about, we looked at look at these Southern groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and how they waged a strategic communication campaign, right? To take who were deemed as traitors, the Confederacy, right? I mean, you take up arms against your host country, you're a traitor, right? To get those people memorialized as heroes, and not just heroes, but you see the mounting of statues and streets and memorials named after these traitors, right? And so you look at how organizational actors can use the tools and strategy of public relations to push and advance a narrative that shapes and alters memory. And so we talked about camouflage. In this case, the term was camouflage, right? And it's a strategy to sort of mask, camouflage, you obscure, definitely that reconstruction. Yeah, you obscure, that what is available to be seen. And there was also another article. So I think the fifth stage is how marginalized groups challenge and contest those constructed memories. So in that one, it was a piece that I and a doc student wrote from Texas A&M when I was there in 2015. And this piece was HBCUs as relics or reminders, race remains relevant in a post-racial society, exploring and expanding the role of memory in public relations. So what are the tools that the marginalized have to take up advocacy, to battle narratives, collective memories, statements that work against their collective interest, right? So President Barack Obama's elected. We are in a post-racial society. So why do you have historically Black colleges and universities? What role are they serving? If that seems separatist, right? And so, but when you look at when you look at like a famous coach, Dion Sanders, he was a star football player in the National Football League, American football. Sorry, I know football, global soccer. So American football. He's a coach at an HBCU, and he could have coached anywhere, but he's a coach at HBCU. And you talk about the disparity and the resources that these schools still face. So but anyway, so that piece was talking about how we challenge, how we confront, how can groups contest these prevailing narratives of memory. So how do you counteract what the United Daughters of the Confederacy had done, right? So that's the other side of that coin. And then a future piece that I hope will be out soon is like highlighting, and I saw some of the comments in there, that selective memory, that revisionist history, if you will. In this piece, we're talking about the dialectic of memory, right? So it's not just the erasing is not just the etching. I think the beautiful part and the strategic part is in the blurring of memory, right? And how do society, how do publics, how do organizations navigate this dialectic, you know, that's constantly this tug and tension between etching memory, erasing memory, and that blurring of memory. And so in this piece, you know, we use the attacks on the US Capitol on January 6th. You know, and we're making this case, right, that if you follow the news coverage closely, there are people who still believe that they were patriot. It was their patriotic duty. It was their patriotic duty to stop the election, stop the conferring of the election, or the certification of the election results, the installment of Joe Biden. And historically, what we've seen, historically, there's always been a peaceful transfer of authority of power in the US until this time, right? And Trump, prior to, you know, the elections, was planting the seed. If I lose, the election was stolen, i.e. stop the steal, right? I mean, and there are people who, you know, this is the blurring of the facts, the blurring of memory, but there are people who subscribe and wholeheartedly believe that the election was still stolen, even though there are tons of evidence to the contrary, right? And then you have others who, in this narrative, in this space, you know, saying, hey, you know, this was an act of insurrection. This truly was an act of domestic terrorism. And so in this is different than the United Daughters of the Confederacy waging a campaign, right? And this is a broader conceptualization of we need to look at the ethical implications of blurring. We need to look at, and I say camouflage is a form of blurring, right? I mean, we need to look at, is there ever a time when blurring is practical? And so on the flip side of that, you know, in there we're giving case exemplars of, you know, sort of the natives at one of the famed monuments in the U.S. is Mount Rushmore, where you have 4 prominent white male figures in U.S. history carved into the side of a mountain. But that mountain is sacred native land, right? And so as people go to tour Mount Rushmore, you have activists out there trying to blur that, you know, with facts, you know, but blurring that, you know, that intersected in here, trying to interrupt this dominant narrative, and waging a campaign to say, please stop supporting this. Please return our mountain to us. This is sacred native land. And I think that there are, of course, several other areas I think where memory research can apply and is applicable in public relations. But I try to share articles that presented how I viewed the role of public memory in public relations and the relationship between memory and public relations, you know, from, again, memorializing in crisis, so the etching, the strategic use of memory, and that was Bale's 2011 piece on following the tragic bombing in Oklahoma City. The second was sort of that practitioner role in creating organizational memory through artifacts, through tools, through shaping employee engagement. And that was the Waymer and Logan piece. Cultural memory, the paradox of erasure. So going from the etching to the other side, hey, how do practitioners strategically try to erase memory and highlight that default or that de facto strategy is flawed because you can't erase. So why in practice are we so quick to try to remove a star, try to remove a banner, from a team? And I love that, Michael. Yes, corrupt gaslighting. I love that. So I'm gonna recap, and then we're gonna open this thing up because I keep seeing the comments popping up, and I'm loving it. And I want to dive into a lot of that. But the paradox of erasure, memory cannot be erased, but what are the implications of trying to erase memory? Cultural memory as hegemonic, and organizations strategically trying to create memory to their advantage, or camouflage memory to their advantage. That's the Heath and Waymer in Public Relations Review, the Southern White Heritage Narrative Continuity. Next is how marginalized groups challenge those dominant narratives and articulations of memory. Waymer and Street, Public Relations Inquiry 2015, and memory as a dialectic, and looking at blurring and the role of blurring. Gaslighting would be a form of blurring, right? So it would fall under that conceptualization of strategic attempts to blur memory. But looking at that dialectic between erasure and etching, and how blurring can be used in any of those to etch, to erase, but really that contestation of memory. And won't say about that because the piece, piece is under review, so hopefully it'll come out and then I can share it with Michael later to update the list that was shared. But yeah, I'll stop now. But I wanted to just give you how I saw what memory is, and I think Michael, you might have been tracking the comments. So if you can, go with hands or pull some of those comments so we can keep the discussion going.
Okay, well, Dean's already got his hand up, so I'll let Dean start us off, and then we can come back to the comments.
Okay, I'm just intrigued by this. I'm familiar with everything you said, but I never thought of it in terms of memory. It's got me thinking in certain ways here. I got a whole bunch of notes written down, but and talking about cancel culture and the blurring, et cetera. But one thing I'll just toss out, and I'm not sure. I think I'm correct in general on this, but I've also noticed, like, I remember one time I was 92 when Vince and Carl and I, we were walking around when BMW brought several of us to Berlin, and there was Adolf Hitler's bunker. Nothing indicated. If it wouldn't have been Vince or Carl saying this is where it is, nothing would have indicated it. And there's no cultural, at least official cultural artifacts, or certainly tangible artistic ones about the Nazi era that I've ever seen. At least they bury it. And I mean, essentially agree with that. But no, there's no Adolf Hitler Junior High Gymnasium or anything like that. Things named after people. But when you contrast that, where I'm going with this, when you contrast this with Eastern Europe and Russia, there are an awful lot of artifacts. I mean, even in remote Eastern Siberia, there's this beautiful bust of Lenin. And even they got Lenin, et cetera. And what I'm saying is that Russia, they seem to embrace that as part of their culture, even though it was, it's hard telling where things are going now. But I mean, they were rejecting communism. They were rejecting the premise of the ideology, at least I'm generalizing here to an extent. But yet they kept the artifacts, and it's very much a part of their culture. And I'm just kind of intrigued. I got to think about that. You got Germany. No, we don't even mention National Socialist Party. And then we've got much of Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, elsewhere. You see these artifacts of communism. I know I got to think about it. I'm not sure I got a point here, but it just your comments got me thinking about how two different regions. One, they just essentially, it's like this: get rid of all artifacts, like we're doing here in the U.S. to a great extent with Southern, Confederate soldier statues, et cetera. And the other one, they essentially say, no, this is part of who we were, and therefore part of who we are. And I don't know, like I say, I got to think about that. I'm not sure I'm making a cogent point here, or or so forth, but you got me thinking in these terms. So, okay, I'm sorry.
Okay. Anybody else? Anybody want to jump in and start something, ask a question, follow up? I can go back through the comments.
Oh, look, just one thing I wanted to say from an Australian point of view, what this really speaks to here is the Great Australian Silence regarding Indigenous Australians and colonisation. So we have a very famous historian here, Henry Reynolds, and he wrote, going back 4 decades, that there's this culture of deliberately forgetting in Australia. So we deliberately forget the massacres, we deliberately forget the conflicts, and so the politics of the moment in Australia is about rediscovering that memory, about doing acknowledgements of country, and corporations and broadcasters always now are identifying the land on the Aboriginal names for the land on which they're coming to, and that's this seems to be very much a political process about re-remembering. Anyway, I just thought that sort of speaks to some of these themes of agonistic dissensus and the wrangle that's really at the heart of memory, which is what you're talking about.
Carl?
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
I can't find my little button to raise my hand. Couple of things to tie in what Damion's been saying and what Dean was just saying, and maybe this last comment as well. And I'm just wondering, Damion, if maybe what we have is yet another dialectic going here, and that the dialectic would be, you're mentioning blurring a lot. And it seems to me that blurring is typically used, at least often used, in conjunction with accentuating. On the one hand, what happens is the blurring of some things. I'm going to go to the Nazi example in a minute, Dean. Sometimes blurring involves accentuating other parts of memory instead. So, for example, in the case of what's been going on in Ukraine, well, let me go back to Hitler first. Hitler didn't just blur the role of Jewish culture and the place of Germany in the world and all of these other things that he blurred up. He also accentuated. He played selectively for history with Aryan as a notion, and tracking that back to other parts of the world and so on, and that was where the big emphasis would be. Or more recently in Ukraine, where Putin is and others are not just blurring, but Ukraine is. They're trying to blur the memory of Ukraine as a nation. They're also accentuating at the same time the parts of the history of Ukraine and Russia, while ignoring or blurring other parts of the history of Ukraine and Russia, so that they they accentuate the purpose of blurring what's the current relationship of Ukraine and Russia. And I'm not sure about all of this, but it just seems to me that talking about blurring alone is enough. We probably need to think about the selective accentuation and the selective blurring of different things. I see Bob's hand up.
Dean, there is a very interesting book out written by Taylor and Khrushcheva, and Nina Khrushcheva is Nikita Khrushchev's granddaughter. It's called In Putin's Footsteps. And she talks about a lot of those monuments, even the recurrence of the name Vladimir. There's a very famous Vladimir in Ukraine, one in early Russia, and then one more recently, right? So she kind of tracks that a little bit. But I think her argument is that what Russia suffers from is either incoherent coherence or coherent incoherence. That they don't quite know who they are, but they keep these monuments because something might be meaningful, and they're kind of nice. So we leave them up, but we don't know why we leave them up. But we like to leave them up. And so I think that's one way of looking at it. It's not an easy book to read. I think she jumps around. She needed a good editor. But it's an interesting book, In Putin's Footsteps.
Okay. I think it's
Some
interesting.
good comments in there, Michael. Yeah.
So, sorry, what was that?
No, I was just reading the comments as they pop up. I'm like, there's some really good comments.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting that, you know, the daughters of the, you know, of the Confederate like those guys' daughters, you know, after the war were like, we have to bring back the memory of our families, you know, like I really doubt it was the daughters, but they constructed that whole thing, right? Those daughters, who's going to argue or fight about the daughters wanting to do this as opposed to somebody else? So they very clearly selected somebody who could get their message across to perpetuate their story that they wanted to tell, which was this sort of blurring of history.
And that goes back to Elliot, Elizabeth Elliot's work in the 1840s and 1850s, where she did her books about women in the American Revolution that were incredibly focused on shaping memory of the revolution in order to inform current politics. I find the fact her work is so often overlooked and is quite marginal really fascinating, given, you know, they were some of the best-selling books of their day. They were incredibly important.
What was the name again? Alice?
Elizabeth Elliot.
Elliot.
Yeah, she wrote a lot of pieces in Godey's Ladies book in the 1840s and 1850s. And she published 3 books, one of which was called A Domestic History of the American Revolution, that was a standard textbook in schools.
How's it spelled? The Ellet.
Ellet.
Oh. Okay.
I did some master's research on her and I just find her fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So what I see is that in the argument that I've been making now in a series of pieces is that, you know, and based on the comments, like memory is an understudied and underexplored area of public relations that has so many implications in society, how we might, in practice, how we might segment publics strategically, how we might carry out activist aims, right? I mean, so in terms of the practice, but I also think there's some theorizing that could be done in this area, and or at least broader conceptualization. And so of course I couldn't send all of it, but what was interesting was when so we advanced the paradox of erasure, and put it in. You mentioned cancel culture earlier. So first that piece came out, and then I worked with Sherry Vale. She called me one day and she said, "Hey, Damion, there's this mural that's posted that's in a building here at the University of Kentucky." She was at Kentucky at the time, and she said, she's like, I think the paradox of erasure framework is happening here. How, but I need your help. Like I want to tell this case, but let's push this forward. And so after we talked about the case and analyzed, we actually expanded, some categories of the conditions upon which erasure happened, right? And so context of that case at the University of Kentucky is that there was a mural painted, on a wall in one of the oldest university buildings on campus. And so at the time, it was commissioned as part of one of the public works in Kentucky, I think around the 50s or 60s. And it was commissioned by, a Black artist. And so they did the work, but it was sort of images of, natives and blacks and whites and you can pull up the mural, or if I could share, I would share. But it was a mural, and so standards change. So 20 years, 30 years later, you have students on campus, students of color on campus who say this mural is offensive. You know, we find the imagery in this mural offensive. And so they covered the mural, and then what they did was they commissioned maybe the original artist would like but then they commissioned an artist to paint another mural in the dome of the building, you know, put fancy gold leaf up in the building and so forth and so on, to add more context to the mural. And people still protested, new administration, new students. So eventually, following the murder of George Floyd, the students rallied again, and it was enough momentum because they said, look, it truly, you know, it cost the university too much to pull out the mural because it was painted on the central wall in the building. But long story short, after all of these years, they finally said they were going to take down the mural and the dome, right? But you had president commissioning groups of people to come together, you know, a committee to talk about what was best, what was in the best interest. And ultimately, all of that went out the window when it was like, no, this has to happen, this mural and this painting has to come down. And there were critics who were saying, hey, you're actually canceling the work of a Black artist. And they were like, we don't care. Like this is just offensive. It needs to go. And so we use that case to actually expand, you know, the parameters and the conceptualization of erasure. Again, and paradoxically, right? Like you're erasing this or trying to erase this, but it's not. Yes, definitely, public relations is the part of negotiating these conflicts. And so I think there is great avenues for, if anything, I want to encourage more of us to engage in memory work in public relations and wrestle with these interesting and messy contestations and actually advance and build theory and concepts around it. There's much work to be done in this area, and it's interesting because the news and what's happening in our world gives us fodder to think about and process and theorize about memory and its relationship and role in public relations.
Michael, or can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just really finding this intriguing because I never really thought of this in terms of memory. I mean, in some ways it's obvious with much of what a guy person does, but I've never really thought of it in these terms. I'm probably really depress my students on a regular basis. I always tell them that, you know, when I was a single digits, you know, in a relatively innocuous post-World War II, you know, 50s, but then the 60s, social unrest, assassinations, war, you name it. And I said, you know, okay, this is as crazy as it can get. And I said, no, you guys are living in a far crazier time than, you know, at your age than I am. But the point I want to make here is that where does this memory come from? Where, like, Sweden now, the Democrat, not the Social Democrats, but the Democratic Party with neo-Nazi traditions did very well in the elections. In Italy, and it's really neat, they got the first woman president. But what isn't neat is that the tradition of that party is neo-fascism. And you know, these are really, by today's standards and by our, you know, younger people, these are ancient ideologies. But yet there's a memory of them. There must be an idealization of them where, oh, hey, and the way they explain it simplistically in Sweden is that, you know, it's a reaction against crime and against immigration, and to some extent also Italy. But here these old ideologies, say, whether they were festering somewhere underneath, or there was also an element of people there that were advocating it. but suddenly they are in contemporary society again. Neo-socialist or neo-national socialist and fascism. And, to me, it's dumbfounding. But I mean, this idea of memory and how it exists and how it is forming public opinion really is intriguing to me. Ended up being a sermon, I guess, more than a point. But anyhow, I am intrigued by this.
Michael, would you want Kay typed in? She said that she can't speak, but I think she raised something interesting here. Would you want to? I'm trying to pull it. I'm working from my phone, so sorry.
Yeah, she said the importance of saying a name, remembering the name, and then in the UK, the confusion about what to do with statues gets so much a part of history that many do not see as offensive, which I think is consistent with what we also have seen in the South, is you've got this group of people who are like, this is part of our history. And I think there is a difference, though, between the constructed history, although these probably, I don't know enough about the UK statues, but I'm sure they are largely constructed as well, and sort of a genuine history, but I'm not sure there is really a genuine history. But both of them lead to how people think about things, influence our memory.
And so there will always be competing memories, right, operating in a society at any given moment, right? I mean, but this, so as someone mentioned, I think Aaron mentioned, hey, isn't public relation play a part in negotiating these memories? And I would say yes, but oftentimes when you start thinking about other theoretical frameworks, right? Sometimes if you're looking at game theory or so where it's a zero-sum game, there is no negotiation. There is no negotiation between the United Daughters of the Confederacy and those who are saying, when I see a Confederate general on a horse, this reminds me, this reminds me of the overseer. The police in the U.S. were instituted to retrieve runaway slaves, right? And so when I walk past this statue, seeing this white man mounted on this horse, all I'm thinking about is being chased, how my ancestors were chased and rallied and put back into bondage. So there is no negotiation. It really is now public relations is the activist tool to either, right, zero-sum game in that, to kind of destroy, again, but the paradox of erasure. You're trying to destroy that memory, or in the case of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, you're trying to camouflage, blur, reposition that memory as one of nobility, one of honor. It's not hate, it's heritage.
But they are negotiating when they're forced into it in terms of don't destroy our statue, let us preserve our history. Let's move this statue somewhere else so that it can still have its meaning, but it won't offend you. So when you push them, they ultimately they want to preserve their view. But you're right, there isn't they're never going to come to an agreement. Dean's got his hand up.
I just, to illustrate a point, I remember once, I think it was 2011 in St. Petersburg, Russia, and the United Russian spokesperson was saying at this conference, and caused shock afterwards. Everybody's asking me, is this true? But they said that American textbooks, like secondary school textbooks, say that the Americans won World War II. We were allies with the Russian, but from their point of view, they won World War II and we might have had a part in it. But this shocked them to the point where several people were asking me, is that true? Well, yeah, that's the way I learned it. Yeah, the Russians were there, but we beat the Germans and so forth. And I guess both that memories, there's competing memories and both have an element of truth, but it is interesting. I think it illustrates some of the several points some of you were making there. Yeah.
Even when World War II started, 39 or 41. That's it. Yeah. Because growing up in Australia, we moved to the States when I was younger, and we were always amazed that once we got there, it was 41 instead of 39.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it's always interesting that when we talk about statues and such, we have a sense of looking back. But the reality is we're really looking forward. And that's what I would argue that's what the insidious part of the memory is, that the looking forward means we're going to have winners, we're going to have a set of social constructs that define where we go down the road. And I am absolutely convinced that the enduring sense of states' rights, which has come back rather loudly in this country. I say that because I live in one of the most states' rights states in the right. And I think that's very, very close to Robert E. Lee up on top of his statue. I mean, this is not looking back with just adoration. It is looking forward with a sense of, we will tell you how this narrative works out. And it works out because we get to tell you how it works out. Probably the greatest mistake that Lincoln and Grant made was being nice guys. I say that because I'm working on my family history, and I've got at least 33 Union soldiers that I've written about in the last several days, and it's probably 10 times that number. I just don't have time to go down all the list. But this whole notion of what kind of a nation we've got, there is so much states' rights in this nation, and it's coming into the Supreme Court again in a way that was simply not there 25 years ago. And I think that is our great challenge for the future. Do we have a federal system or do we have a state system? And all of those statues out there are speaking to that.
You know, so again, you layer, you know, again, I love where Carl said, hey, you might have this dialectic, you know, but you know, it's also the accentuation, like, you know, so forcing me to even say, okay, well, you might have something build, you might have something build. You know, what Bob just mentioned, saying, hey, you know, we see the states' rights issue playing itself out where it didn't, not 25 years ago. And again, I think about from the issues management lens, right, where you talk about the cycle of issues, right? You know, and then you have this dormant stage, right? But then an issue can easily, issues never die, they're never resolved. They might just be forgotten about temporarily until some sort of catalyst, right, triggers the reemergence of the issue, the contestable questions of fact, value, policy, identity, and place, right? And so and the reason why they lie dormant and not is because you can't erase memory, right? Like you cannot, and it's paradoxical to believe that you can, because there's some vestige of it that can be recalled and brought back. You know, so when Bob says, hey, it wasn't here 25 years ago, we have been fighting that battle of states' rights versus a federal union since, you know, the Civil War. And
or earlier.
right, and what we're seeing is that what we thought was resolved, dormant issue, emerge and emerge and emerge again. And so people are up at arms in sort of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Right? I mean, you know, but rest assured that issue is not over, right? You know, because people who vehemently oppose that overturning are mounting campaigns strategically to battle back against it. And so it's just looking at the context of issues management or other sort of frameworks and conceptualizations and trying to bring them together to find innovative ways to either theorize what we're seeing happening in our society, but also how we might be able to help society be a better place, right? If we believe in these normative frameworks of public relations, how we can help society be a better place to live and work and be.
What I find interesting about the women's health issue is that the state legislatures in many states got together among themselves in their own little state capitals, and they came up with all of these nifty little laws. And then when they realized that there were other states out there that had their nifty little laws, all of a sudden they began to melt down and want to change things because they had talked themselves, well, the standard metaphor on MSNBC is the dog caught the bus.
I am intrigued here, again, just some of the recent comments, like who had these memories? You're talking about the memories, come up again and so forth. But I think it's still a fraction of people who must have kept these memories alive among themselves, and they start getting some traction. And you're talking about state rights and so forth. But there must be cores of people or groups of people that were really invisible until certain factors, variables occurred, and suddenly these ideas, these memories, if you will, get traction. I guess what I'm saying is, where were these memories that most people didn't have? They're being held by a small group of people who apparently were communicating with one another. I don't know. This interests me. I don't know what the answer is.
That's exactly the answer, Dean. Like in part, so when in the Paradox of the Positive Peace in Rome, it was actually a tourism. That could also be a tourism public relations piece, because part of what happened was I toured Rome. I walked the city of Rome, but I went on guided tours to quickly try to get a sense of the land and then do my individual things. And it's amazing when you have native Roman who are telling you about the Colosseum, right? Who are telling you about, who are calling, the wedding cake building, right? When they try to unify Italy, and and they call it a monstrosity. Like the Romans hate it. The Romans hate so Mussolini, they said Mussolini destroyed so much Roman artifacts because he was narcissistic, and he had his balcony, and he could see from his balcony in the distance the Colosseum, and he said, and there were no roads there. It was just Roman artifacts, and he built probably like an 8 wide lane road to connect his balcony to the Colosseum, right? Because he wanted to be, connected to the greatness of Rome. But you hear these Romans, they hate the Vatican. Like I had a Roman, they took us to the Vatican, and one of the tour guides says, okay, this is where I stop. At the end of the tour, she's like, I'm going back to my country. I enjoyed giving you the tour of the Vatican, and they highlighted all of the artifacts that the Roman Catholic Church took. So those Romans are passing down. I'm 5th generation Roma, 7th generation Roma, and so so again, you think about frameworks. Standpoint theory. They say that the perspective of the marginalized provides a more holistic picture of what's happening in the broader society, because they have greater motivation to understand the perspective of the majority of those in power, the oppressor, as a survival mechanism. Mm-hmm. And you think about what's happening in the U.S. in that sort of context as well. It's the stories are just passed down. Your father was a general, and your grandfather, so forth and so on. So the stories, are just passed down, but we don't see them because the dominant narrative is prevailing. And so again, you think of all those frameworks. So the silent majority, if you will, right? So president, so those latent attitudes were there in the US. I think President Trump being elected just empowered, emboldened those persons and those perspectives to come out and state those positions publicly.
Erin's got her hand up then.
Thanks. Just quickly on the museum thing, one thing I find interesting is there's been a bit of a movement towards these sort of guerrilla guided tours. So people make podcasts where you can have an alternate history or a history from below, reinterpreting museums, which I think is quite fascinating. There's a podcast on the ABC in Australia called Stuff the British Stole that talks about British museums and how they're filled with stolen artifacts. But just with my practitioner hat on, we do a lot of work around memory in shaping places. And that's a really important part of what we do. And I'm working on a project at the moment where we're looking to do some renewal work in a public housing estate. And a big part of that is collecting people's memories of the neighbourhood and figuring out how we can reflect the history of the area and people's memories of the area within the built environment. And we're actually it's legislated that we need to do that. So it's not just a nice to do, it's part of our regulatory framework around engagement ahead of doing these built environment projects.
I found my hand. I wanted to partially answer Dean by saying that some of that memory that we're talking about is locked away in those school textbooks that the children pack around and so forth. I had a good friend, a history faculty member at the University of Houston, who got $60,000 every time a new edition of the history books that he reviewed came out in the state of Texas. But he also knew that part of what he had to do was to make sure that Texas looked very heroic or he would lose his contract. And so now it's interesting, we had the 1619 project, and of course, Trump then had to have the 1776 project. And I'm here to announce to you that the state of Texas has the 1836 project, which begins Texas history with the Alamo, which as I recall is a defeat. How in the world a defeat got translated into the iconic success story of this state would seem to me to be a great public relations coup. Now that's what we ought to study. But the other thing that's interesting is this brochure, and I'm after it, Damion. I want to get my hands on it. It is done by the TEA, which I assumed then was going to make sure that it got into the public school system. But I guess that might have been too controversial. So where is it going to be distributed? Through the Department of Public Safety. New driver's license getters, people that get their first driver's license or their first Texas driver's license will be handed a copy of the 1836 project. Now, I haven't figured all of this out. I got to get me, a good sleuth on this one. It is slippery and wandering around, but I'll track it down one way or the other. And I'll also get a hand a copy of it. But it's in the schools. That's where a lot of that memory exists. And heavens only knows how many times did somebody say to you, well, look, this is what I read. It had to be true. Why would they put it down if it isn't true?
Well, yeah, high school textbooks are notoriously inaccurate, and they say that they have on average an error on every page. And I edited, before I got my first professor job, worked at Simon Schuster for about 6 months, editing a high school history textbook. Oh, there's at least an error on every page, and half the time I was like, this, like Sault Ste. Marie isn't in this state, it's in a different state. and this didn't actually happen. You can look in a dictionary and find the answer to that. It's just filled with erroneous information.
Narrative, memory.
It's really, a few years ago, probably a few summers ago, and I was before COVID, it was after George Floyd. I started this essay I never had a chance to finish about kind of a longitudinal analysis of racism. And where I still got to think a lot of things. So I don't know when I'll ever get to it again, but I'm kind of wondering, I'm not at all opposed. In fact, I applaud and certainly support the narratives that we all hear. But in turn, I think maybe I don't know myself as well as I think I do, but in many ways, I think I would describe myself as post-racial in that I didn't even think about it. I mean, every day I interact with all kinds of people, just every type of person. I didn't think about it. And then with all the, now I'm more sensitive to races, which in one respect is good, but in another respect, I kind of lost something in that now it's kind of like, instead of, hey, here, we're friends, and now, well, no, we've got these differences that we're trying to overcome. And I'm not articulating that well, and it's, like I say, I don't know how many pages written on it, but it's just kind of, like I say, I kind of find myself in a way where now it's like, okay, pick your own, here's a black person, like, gee, this person might not like me. Before that, I really didn't worry about, hey, we're friends, we've been friends for years or so, and so forth. And like I say, I got to think that straight to my head. And then the other thing that I think is something at least considering is that I understand I certainly understand, like, where victimhood, obvious examples that we've talked about tonight, victimhood. But there's also a message there of people in all these groups that are doing very well. And you kind of like to say, like, hey, boy, here are these successful, you name it. Here's Damion Waymer, here's was a senior associate dean at college communication, and so forth. And I think sometimes that isn't coming through as much, like, boy, there's a lot of good things that people are doing. I don't know. I'm not saying this as well as I should. Maybe I haven't thought it through myself, but like I say, I kind of find myself from where I always kind of consider, well, if I even thought about it, it's kind of post-racial, where now I'm more sensitive to race than other types of diversities, and in some ways that's good. The sensitivity is good, but in other ways it's kind of like, I'm not sure if it was fully. I kind of like the things the way they were before, where like, hey, I don't even recognize any differences, rather than now I'm kind of sensitive to things. I'm not articulating as well as I probably shouldn't even mention it until I would be able to articulate it better. But like I say, I just kind of find it interesting here. So I don't know, maybe anybody's got any thoughts on that?
I think. Did I interrupt somebody? Go ahead.
Go ahead, Carl.
Part of that sense that a lot of Anglos have, I think, probably reflects what was mentioned, I forget by who earlier in the conversation, as standpoint theory. And that may have been Damion, I forget. But part of standpoint theory would suggest that Anglos can forget or ignore race in some context, but that minorities can't, or are less free to do so.
It's a fair point.
And so,
yeah,
I think you're being concerned with it is better, if you'll excuse that term, than not noticing it.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
Mike, you're muted again, I think.
Sorry about that. So Damion, do you want to add anything else? You want to wrap us up? What do you wanna-
I'm sorry, hold on. You know, like I said, I'm on my phone, and so I just lost video. Give me a second.
No worries.
Hear you.
Okay, Zoom, close.
There you are.
You're back.
Yes, so no, I don't have anything else. I love to wrap this up. If everybody's okay with that. Michael, again, I just want to thank you for putting on this series and giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts around, I think, a very interesting area of research on memory and public relations. And it's understudied. And I think it's an area that has promise. I hear, I know that there are some doctoral students on here, freshly minted students here. And I think if anything resonated with you tonight, think about how your work, how memory truly might influence, your work. I mean, so much of public relations research published in our journals, comes from sort of the post-positive paradigm, and they're looking at the effects of messages, looking at corporate social advocacy, looking right and trying to use structural equation modeling to predict or describe certain behaviors based on what an organization does on this particular behavior, this particular variable dimension, right? I mean, but you might be able to measure the effect in that moment, right? I mean, but again, if an organization is taking a stand on a controversial political, social, public issue, you're measuring the effect, or experimentally in that one moment, right? And 2 months, 3 months later, depending on what's happening in the social, societal context, what you measured in that case may not be valid because memory is fluid, society is fluid, a narrative is fluid. And so I truly would encourage us to pick up the mantle and really look at the power of memory, because public relations is in the memory telling and memory shaping and memory contesting business. It's at the heart of it. And I encourage us to look at how memory intersects with our work and our frameworks, from issues management to engagement frameworks, to dialogue. It's there and it has promise. And so I'd like others to pick up this mantle with me and really delve into this area.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank you because it's a great talk. You brought up a whole bunch of ideas. I think I can say I think most people we don't think in these terms about what we do. We've got this established literature, and we're sort of so many people still studying crisis. Like we haven't done enough of that when there's all of these other interesting and important questions we could be posing. And I also want to thank you because Maureen was the first Sydney lecture, and she gave it much like a graduate class. And I think yours is probably you and maybe Oyvind Elin were the next two who made it like a class. None of my professors ever put up slides for me when I was in class watching. And we discussed topics and ideas and readings. And so I think it was a lot of fun probably for all of us. And I think it was a class you'd tell us all to go work on our papers because they're due next week. But anyway, I want to thank you for it. It was great.
Thanks, Michael.
Okay,
everyone. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm going to stop recording here.
Okay.
I will certainly remember this